Speaking of which, I have the pleasure of introducing another congressman who says what he believes, who follows up on what he says. In this particular topic, he has been incredible in terms of speaking the truth, and not just speaking the truth, and not just hearing one thing and parroting it himself. I've had the opportunity to interact and speak with Congressman Tom McClintock more than once, and it's really a refreshing and challenging experience because he asks questions, sometimes challenging questions. He has information that he shares that is something that will make me and my colleagues say, that's a fantastic point, something we hadn't considered. With Congressman McClintock, we have somebody who gets it and who also has the character to follow up on what he says and the strength and courage and conviction to speak that truth to other members of Congress, to members of whatever administration may be in power at the time, and to not leave us behind. He's somebody who truly represents the people. He's somebody who truly represents sound science. Congressman McClintock is the ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee's Water, Ocean, and Wildlife Subcommittee, and that's an appropriate acronym because, wow, Congressman McClintock, you do a fantastic job. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Congressman Tom McClintock.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank each and every one of you for your support of the Heartland Institute. Heartland is always the very first organization that we've turned to in order to get credible, science-based testimony on Capitol Hill. Ironically, almost all of the leftist witnesses are not scientists, and still fewer are genuine climate scientists, and Heartland has always come through with the most authoritative and scientific analyses at these hearings, and I cannot thank you enough. As you more than anyone know, the left has been trying to shut down all debate on this question for many years with every tool that they have: ridicule, intimidation, and the heavy hand of government power. So when the Democrats began holding hearings and Heartland Institute scholars began showing up and an actual debate began to unfold, our friends on the left seem to have lost a lot of their interest in those hearings. In fact, I think they gave us a critical opportunity to engage them on the actual science behind their apocalyptic predictions, and they didn't like where it leads. That their problem is that all apocalyptic deadlines tend to come and go without much apocalypse. Our problem is that instead of learning from their folly, they just move on to the next doomsday prophecy. In fact, just this past week, no less an authority than Prince Charles solemnly warned that we have just 18 months to address the climate crisis. Now, I suppose you could call that a redo, because in 2009 he warned we had only 100 months to save the planet. Happily, the world safely and quietly passed this apocalyptic ultimatum 2 years ago without much muss and fuss at all. Now, in all fairness, he did generously revise his prediction back in 2015 to give us 35 years so that we could all eat, drink, and be merry before our excesses destroyed planet Earth. But what God's anointed sovereign to be giveth, he taketh away. So at present it appears we have just 18 more months. At least Congresswoman Cortez gives us 12 years, so I think for now we need to stick with her. On the other hand, I suppose I have as much authority as either of them to make predictions, so I'll give us another 4.5 billion years, which is the amount of time the climate's already been changing on the planet. Although I doubt my prediction will generate the same attention as all the others out there. This would be amusing, except that it continues to drive public policy despite the failure of every one of their predictions and forecasts to coincide with the actual data that we've accumulated since this nonsense began. Indeed, in the ClimateGate scandal, the world's leading climate change panic promoters were even caught red-handed fabricating data, which ought to be a dead giveaway that they're not scientists, they're charlatans. Abraham Lincoln once told the story of boarding with the family of a Presbyterian minister on the night of the greatest meteor shower ever recorded in North America. He was awakened by the minister, who shouted, "Arise, Abraham, for the heavens are falling and the day of judgment has arrived." But Lincoln noticed that despite all of the hysteria around him and the chaos above him, that he could still see those familiar old constellations fixed in the sky, and he knew that the world was not about to end. And that's why I want to thank the Heartland Institute and all of those who support it. The more shrill the left becomes in its apocalyptic predictions, the more important and more persuasive is the calm reason and sound science highlighted by many of the leading voices in actual climatology that you bring together. We all know the story of Chicken Little, who freaks out when an acorn drops on her head and concludes the sky is falling and creates a general panic for a while until a calm neighbor points out the innocuous source of her hysteria. As the Little Ice Age plunged the planet into the bitter period of cold between the 15th and 18th centuries, history actually records exorcisms conducted on the edges of advancing glaciers and witch hunts to punish those responsible for the famine and disease and suffering that this era of prolonged cold produced. Now, maybe they actually caught the witch, because the Little Ice Age came to an end to be replaced by the modern warm period that we very thankfully enjoy today. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson noted the climate change as we entered the modern warm period in his notes on the state of Virginia in 1799. He said, "Snows are less frequent and less deep. They do not often lie below the mountains more than 1, 2, or 3 days, and very rarely a week. They are remembered to have been formerly frequent, deep, and of long continuance. The elderly inform me that the earth used to be covered with snow about 3 months in every year. The rivers, which then seldom failed to freeze over in the course of the winter, scarcely ever do now." Now, those words are familiar to all of us who have read anything on this subject. The difference, though, between Jefferson's observations and those that we read today is Jefferson didn't freak out. It was called the Age of Reason for a reason. Now, we laugh at the superstition and folly of those who blamed witchcraft for the severe climate change of the Little Ice Age. But I'm convinced future generations are going to be looking at ours in precisely the same way, except our generation won't have the excuse of ignorance. With all of our knowledge and technology, we've allowed ourselves once again to be thrown into panic over forces that have been at work shaping our planet since it formed. As Newsweek published in April, there are ominous signs that the Earth's weather patterns have begun to change dramatically, and that these changes may portend a drastic decline in food production, with serious political implications for just about every nation on Earth. The advanced signs of fundamental changes in the world's weather. That was in April, all right. It was April of 1975. In an article reflecting the pseudo-scientific consensus of the day that man-made pollution was about to trigger catastrophic global cooling. On July 9, 1971, the Washington Post ran a lurid headline: "U.S. scientists sees new ice age coming," and reported that the world, quote, "could be as little as 50 or 60 years away from a disastrous new ice age." The NASA scientist who reached this ridiculous conclusion did so with the assistance of a computer model developed by, wait for it, our own James Hansen. You know, the left has been able to generate and sustain its current movement because it begins, like the tale of Chicken Little, with one undeniable fact. No one denies our planet is presently warming. It's called the modern warm period. Carbon dioxide levels are increasing from the record lows reached during the Holocene, and ocean levels are slowly rising. But warming is nothing new. Our planet's been warming on and off since the last ice age. When Barack Obama came to Yosemite Valley in my district a few years ago to complain that Yosemite's glaciers would soon disappear, I couldn't help but think that if he'd been standing on the same spot giving the same speech 12,000 years ago, he would have been covered by more than 3,000 feet of glacial ice. There have been periods within recorded history and throughout paleo history when scientists tell us temperatures were much higher than they are today. Science tells us that carbon dioxide levels have varied widely throughout the planet's history, and during most of it have been many times higher than they are today. Science tells us at the end of the last ice age, ocean levels were 400 feet lower than they are today, and the current rise has been steady, small, and doesn't correlate with increases in carbon dioxide levels. Hurricane activity is much lower than that recorded in the 18th century. The left loves to call us climate change deniers. The fact is, they deny the science of climate change, the science that documents dramatic changes in climate throughout the epochs that long predate the appearance of mankind. Ogden Nash put it this way. He said, "The ass was born in March, the rains came in November. Such a flood as this," he said, "I scarcely can remember." And despite what we're constantly told, there is a vigorous debate within the scientific community over how human activity compares with vastly more powerful natural influencers that have driven climate change for these 4.5 billion years. As Chicken Little belatedly discovered, there is a big difference between an acorn and the sky. Science thrives on civil and dispassionate debate. So when someone tells you the debate's over, that dissent should be forbidden and dissenters should be personally attacked, that is not a scientist talking, that is a politician. Ultimately, to bring this silly season of pseudoscience to a close, we need two things. The first is facts, and that's what the Heartland Institute has been marshaling so well for so long. And the other is courage. And no one is more courageous these days than a climate scientist in this oppressive political climate who's willing to stand apart from the mob and stand upon the facts no matter how much ridicule, professional retaliation, and personal attacks they have to endure. History has revered and honored those who have done so in ages long gone by, and will again as the history of this era is finally recorded. Another of the ageless tales that describe our own peculiar human nature and that sheds some light on this debate today is that of the emperor's new clothes. You all know the story. A team of grifters descends upon a palace, proclaims themselves to be the finest tailors who weave a cloth so magnificent that only the wise and virtuous can see it. The emperor wraps himself in nothing and parades the streets as all the townspeople compete to signal their own virtue and wisdom by proclaiming how beautiful the material is, even though their own common sense tells them otherwise. And the scheme is successful until a little boy who knows better states the obvious. We all know how that tale ends. The more facts that can be marshaled and the more courage in standing by those facts, the sooner that day will come. Now, some of my colleagues believe that in these days of mass media, where the left dominates the major opinion-shaping organs of society, academia, entertainment, the news media, social media, our resources are simply too slender to begin to educate enough people to turn this around. Science, real science, true science, requires meticulous and unadulterated data, extensive analysis, respectful debate, and successful replication. And how can we compete against simplistic bumper sticker slogans and ad hominem attacks? How can we distill the unassailable work of leading scientists like Judith Curry and David Legates, Roy Spencer, John Christie, Fred Singer, Freeman Dyson, and so many others? How do we match the brilliant presentation we just heard from Lord Monckton against the bumper sticker, and fraudulent bumper sticker at that 97% of scientists all agree? They say, instead, let's just focus on the enormous expense and the radical nature of what the left is proposing. And I agree. that their policies are highly destructive of our prosperity, our abundance, our freedom, and our future. But we cannot abandon the scientific field just because it is hard. And the reason is this: if the left is allowed to occupy that field uncontested, by default, they carry the argument that the earth hangs in the balance. And if the earth truly hangs in the balance, well, then no measure is too extreme, no cost is too great, no governmental excess is too oppressive to enact their agenda. If the mass extinction of all life on this planet is now just 18 months away, or 100 months, or 12 years, or 35 years, take your choice, well, then condemning the entire third world to energy poverty and starvation, and wantonly destroying the prosperity and freedom of the developed nations, well, that might be regrettable and unpleasant, but how small a sacrifice is it in the grand scheme of things if the alternative is a dead planet? So we must continue to engage the left in every forum that we can find, and keep doing so until society reaches that tipping point when common sense reasserts its command over mass hysteria. The work of the Heartland Institute of each and every one of you is absolutely central to this effort and why it is so important that it succeeds. But as we contest this ground, we also need to confront them on the lunacy of their agenda. In a recent interview with the Washington Post, Cortez's chief of staff said, quote, "The interesting thing about the Green New Deal is it wasn't originally a climate thing at all. Do you guys think of it as a climate thing? Because we really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing." It's got me there. $90 trillion of new taxes, replacing 99% of cars within 10 years, eliminating air travel, that would certainly change the economy. But whether or not the Democratic Socialists succeed in placing the United States on the road to Venezuela, I can confidently predict the planet will continue to warm and cool as it has for 4.5 billion years. And by the way, that road ends in Venezuela, but it passes through my state of California on the way, where these policies, pioneered by Jerry Brown and Arnold Schwarzenegger, are now producing among the highest electricity and gasoline prices in the United States and contributing to the highest effective poverty rate by any state in our nation. In fact, I noticed the price for regular gasoline at the ARCO station at Sacramento Airport on Monday. It's now $4.03 a gallon. Meanwhile, policies meant to promote a paradise of electric cars and electric trains are forcing electricity costs in California to grow 5 times faster than the rest of the nation. They're now 50% higher than the national average. Oh, and by the way, we can't guarantee enough electricity to keep your air conditioner running in the summer, so I suppose it's a good thing that's been unusually cool in California this year. We need to confront them on the science. We need to warn the public of the political extremism driving their agenda, and we also need to point out their own hypocrisy. Without ceding an inch to their carbon phobia, there are many ways to reduce carbon dioxide emissions without destroying the lives of working families and producing the kind of reaction that we're seeing this year in the streets of Paris. Yet the left will not go near them. For example, whether or not you attend the Church of Global Warming, it would still be a very good thing to build new nuclear power plants and hydroelectric dams to produce electricity at far lower costs that require far less land than wind and solar. They just happen not to produce any carbon emissions either. As long as temperatures are gently rising and less winter moisture can linger in the mountains as snow, doesn't it make sense to build more reservoirs to save that water rather than to lose it to the ocean? As long as oceans are slowly rising, doesn't it make sense to phase out flood insurance subsidies that encourage people to build on floodplains by hiding their risk? Last year's wildfires pumped 290 million metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, making a mockery of all of their carbon dioxide restrictions. Doesn't it make sense to harvest excess timber before it can choke off the forest and burn? Doesn't it make sense to manage our forests, to match tree density to the ability of the land to support it? Doesn't it make sense to space trees so that snow isn't trapped in dense canopies to evaporate before it can reach the ground? These are all desirable policies in their own right, and they also just happen to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And I guarantee you the left won't accept any of them, which allows us to point out the disingenuous nature of their movement. The tales of Chicken Little and the Emperor's New Clothes are enduring and endearing because they speak to our own vanities, our own fears, and our own nature. Look, we're wired to constantly be alert to danger. We're wired to want to signal our own virtue to one another. And climate hysteria plays directly into these human frailties and goes a long way to explaining how, in the face of reason, science, and common sense, that this ludicrous movement has been able to take such deep root in the body politic. But the more the time goes by and the world doesn't end, the more ridiculous this movement appears. Their own predictions have already been weighed by experience and found wanting. Science is on our side. That's why the left doesn't want to debate it, confront it, and is constantly trying to distort it. Paleoclimatology is on our side. It offers us insight into the complex mechanisms that have influenced Earth's climate since the planet formed, and it offers a sharp contrast with the hysterics of the left. The inconsistencies in the left's own behavior and policies are on our side. They reveal them for what they are, the pampered and self-righteous celebrities and politicians who lecture the rest of us to radically impoverish our quality of life as they jet around the world to swill champagne and gulp caviar at taxpayer-financed climate conferences. That speaks volumes about the true nature of this racket. Their opposition to measures like nuclear and hydroelectricity and active forest management are clear admissions they don't even believe their own rhetoric. The fact is, they know how fragile and precarious their position is, and you know that they know that by the shrillness of their rhetoric and the desperation of their tactics. Of one thing we can be sure, because history is replete with these movements. Reason and science always reassert themselves. A movement that is so wrought with disproven data, with internal contradictions, with logical inconsistencies, and whose policies are so manifestly and obviously harmful to the quality of life of every human being on this planet, a movement like that can only sustain itself with increasingly lurid and hyperbolic predictions, and it is not destined to dominate the public square for very long. Looking at the accumulated data and the irrefutable science and bearing the burdens of the folly that passes for public policy today, I believe that the next generation will look back upon this generation with the same mixture of condescension, amusement, and bewilderment as we now look back at the superstitions that have plagued and misinformed and misguided our civilizations in the past. And those future generations to come will remember with gratitude and admiration that there were organizations like Heartland and faithful servants of true science as those who are gathered here today, willing to endure the injustices and excesses of political demagoguery, to lead us out of the darkness of fear and hysteria and into the light of the bright future that our advancing technology and freedom can and surely will deliver if we let them. Thank you.